I was already fighting a migraine when the candles were lit. Not the kind that makes you wince and power through, but the kind that tightens behind the eyes and turns light into knives. The restaurant was louder than I'd asked for. Someone had moved us closer to the windows. I remember thinking I should have said something earlier before the pressure built before my vision started to shimmer at the edges. It was Saturday, March 9th, and it was my 30th birthday. Everyone stood smiling, phones out. My sister Sloane leaned over the table and laughed, telling me to hurry before the wax dripped. She was 2 years older than me and always confident in rooms like this. The kind of confidence that made people step aside without realizing they had. I tried to smile back. I remember lifting my hand slightly. A small gesture meant to slow things down. The light was too bright. The sound was too sharp. I hadn't even leaned forward yet. Sloane grabbed the cake with both hands and slammed it into my face. The force snapped my head back. I didn't fall forward into laughter the way people do in those videos online. I went backward hard, the chair scraping as I lost my balance. The back of my head struck the edge of the table behind me. There was a dull crack, not loud, but final. I tasted metal before I tasted sugar. For a split second, everything went quiet. Then I heard laughing. Someone clapped. Someone said, "Oh my God, Sloane." Another voice added, "She's always been so sensitive." I sat on the floor with frosting in my hair and blood warm against my scalp, trying to understand why the room felt like it was tilting. Sloane crouched down in front of me, eyes wide, hands fluttering. She kept saying it was a joke. She kept saying I'd leaned back too fast. She smiled before she rearranged her face into concern. My mother waved a napkin in the air and told me to stop making a scene. My stepfather asked if I could stand. No one asked if I could see. The migraine exploded behind my eyes, a deep pounding that synced with my heartbeat. The candles were still burning. Wax dripped onto the cake that now sat crooked on the table, ruined and untouched. Someone joked that at least we'd still get photos. I stood because everyone expected me to. I said I was fine because that's what I'd been taught to say. When the nausea hit, I blamed the migraine. When my vision doubled, I told myself it would pass. Sloane pressed a glass of water into my hand and told me to take something for the pain. She said it softly, like she was helping me, like she always did. I left early, frosting still stiff in my hair, a paper towel pressed against the back of my head. As I drove home, the streetlights smeared into long white lines. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept thinking about how easily I'd lost my balance, how hard the table had felt, how quickly everyone had decided it was nothing. That night, the pain didn't fade. It deepened. The room spun when I closed my eyes, and the dark made the pressure worse, not better. By morning, I would realize this wasn't just another migraine, but on my birthday night, all I knew was that something had crossed a line, and everyone else was pretending it hadn't. By Sunday morning, March 10th, the pain had changed. It wasn't just the familiar throb I'd learned to live around. It felt deeper, heavier, like pressure building behind my eyes with nowhere to go. Light leaked through the curtains in sharp lines, and even that was enough to make my stomach roll. When I tried to sit up, the room tilted, then steadied, then tilted again. I lay back down and told myself it was just the migraine. I had done that my whole life. Migraines were the explanation. Everyone accepted the one that made other questions unnecessary. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from my mother. She asked if I was coming to brunch. She added a smiley face and a reminder not to milk it because people were still talking about the cake. I typed that I wasn't feeling well. She replied almost immediately, saying I needed to stop catastrophizing and get some rest. She said Sloane felt terrible and that I should call her to smooth things over. That was always the order of things. If something went wrong, I was expected to make it right. I closed my eyes and tried to think back to the moment I fell. The way the chair had slid, the way my head had snapped back. There was a gap there, just a blink of missing time. And that bothered me more than the pain. Still, I pushed the thought aside. Gaps happen with migraines. Everyone said so. Growing up, I'd learned the rules early. Sloane was bold, driven, the one with big plans. I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. When Sloane pushed too far, someone would say she meant well. When I pulled back, I was told I was too sensitive. It had always been easier to let it go than to argue. I shuffled into the bathroom and caught my reflection. There was dried blood tangled near my scalp, half hidden by my hair. My eyes looked wrong, slightly unfocused, like I was still underwater. I cleaned myself up slowly, methodically, the way you do when you don't want to think. Another message came in, this one from Sloane. She said she was sorry if I got embarrassed. She said the cake thing was supposed to be funny. She added that I should take my meds and sleep it off. She signed it with a heart. I stared at the phone longer than I meant to. I couldn't remember asking her to refill my water the night before, but I remembered the glass in my hand afterward. I remembered how quickly she'd been there, how calmly she'd spoken, as if she'd done it 100 times. That thought made me uneasy, so I shut it down. Families had rhythms. We all played our parts. Mine was to absorb things quietly and move on. Still, the pain didn't ease. When I tried to read, the words doubled. When I stood at the kitchen counter, I had to grip the edge to stay upright. I thought about work on Monday and how I couldn't show up like this. I thought about how often I'd minimized my own body just to keep everything else smooth. By mid-morning, I was sitting on the couch in the dark, an ice pack pressed against the back of my head, the curtains drawn tight. The migraine meds weren't touching it. The nausea was getting worse. I told myself 1 more hour, then another. Eventually, I picked up my keys. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't want advice or reassurance or reminders about being dramatic. I just wanted someone to look at me and tell me plainly whether this was still something I was supposed to endure. As I locked the door behind me, the sunlight hit my eyes like a blow, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. By the time I reached the emergency room, it was still Sunday, March 10th. Late morning. The parking garage at Crutch Hospital was half full, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo. I had to sit in my car for a moment before getting out, one hand on the steering wheel, waiting for the dizziness to settle. It didn't. Inside, the lights were merciless. I told the triage nurse about the fall, the migraine, the nausea that wouldn't lift. I didn't mention the cake. I didn't know why. It felt childish to say out loud, like I'd be admitting to something embarrassing instead of something that hurt. They took me back quickly once I said I'd hit my head. A nurse wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm and asked me to follow her finger with my eyes. I tried. The finger split into 2, halfway across my vision. She made a note and left the room without comment. The doctor introduced himself as Dr. Harris, mid-50s. Calm voice, the kind of man who didn't rush but didn't linger either. He asked me to describe the incident again. When I hesitated, he waited. When I said I'd fallen backward and hit a table, he nodded and ordered imaging to be safe. I lay still while the machine hummed around my head, counting my breaths, telling myself I was overreacting. Migraines could mimic anything. Everyone knew that. When Dr. Harris came back, he didn't sit down right away. He stood at the computer, staring at the screen longer than felt comfortable. His face changed, not alarmed exactly, but alert, as if something had shifted his attention from routine to careful. He zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, then glanced at me. "Have you had previous injuries to your face or head?" he asked. I shook my head, then stopped because the motion made my stomach lurch. "Not really," I said. "Just migraines." He nodded once slowly and turned the screen toward me. He pointed to a thin, pale line near my skull. "This is a fresh fracture," he said. "It's small, but it's real." I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. relief that the pain had a reason, fear because I hadn't expected that word. Then he pulled up another image. A strange flicker passed through me before he spoke. Not a memory exactly, more like a residue. Standing in my bathroom months ago, the light too bright, my left eye rimmed with yellow and purple, I'd carefully covered with concealer. My mother's voice in the doorway saying migraines made me clumsy, Sloane laughing it off, telling me I must have hit something and forgotten. I remember accepting that explanation because it was easier than wondering why no one thought it was strange. This, he said, tracing a faint outline near my eye socket, is older. It's healed, but not recently. This isn't from last night. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. I don't remember breaking anything, I said. I would have known. Sometimes people don't, he replied gently, especially if they're told it was something else. That sentence landed heavier than the diagnosis. He asked who had been with me when I fell. He also asked what I'd eaten or taken for the migraine and whether I'd had anything to drink. I told him about the water my sister handed me, the medication I'd taken earlier. Blood had already been drawn when I was admitted, and a urine sample collected as part of intake. Later, a nurse explained that routine toxicology screens were limited and timing mattered. If something metabolized quickly or wasn't part of the standard panel, it often left no clear trace. He asked if I'd been discouraged from seeking care before. He asked if anyone helped manage my medications. Each question felt ordinary on its own, but together they formed a shape I didn't recognize yet. I answered carefully. My sister had been there. My family thought I was fine. I'd been told to rest. Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. I want to be clear, he said. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but when we see injury patterns that don't match the explanation, we're required to take a closer look. He stepped out of the room to make a call. While I waited, a nurse came back in and asked if I wanted them to notify my emergency contact. I said no. She explained that with head injuries, especially when imaging showed fractures, and patients showed signs of disorientation, the hospital sometimes reached out anyway as a precaution. I nodded, barely listening. I assumed I'd be discharged soon. I didn't realize the call had already been made. I sat alone, the paper on the exam table crinkling under my fingers, my head throbbing in time with my pulse. I replayed the fall again and again, trying to make it fit the image on the screen. It didn't. When he returned, his tone was still calm, but firmer. He explained the concussion protocol, the monitoring, the need to document everything. He mentioned that a report would be filed, standard procedure, nothing for me to worry about. But I was already worrying. For the first time, the idea slipped into my mind that what happened at my birthday might not have been just careless or cruel, that there might be something there I hadn't been allowed to see. I wasn't ready to believe it. Not yet. All I knew was that an X-ray had told a different story than my family ever had, and that story wasn't finished. I hadn't even finished changing into the hospital gown when my phone started buzzing again. This time it wasn't messages, it was calls. Missed calls stacking up faster than I could silence them. My mother first, then Sloane, then my stepfather. The screen lit up and went dark over and over like a warning I couldn't turn off. It was still Sunday, March 10th, early afternoon now. I hadn't told anyone where I was. I hadn't needed to. They found me anyway. The knock on the exam room door came before Dr. Harris returned. When it opened, my mother stepped in like she belonged there, her purse already slung over her shoulder, her mouth set in a tight line. My stepfather followed, eyes fixed on the floor. Sloane came last, slower, her face arranged into something that looked like concern from a distance. "There you are," my mother said. "We've been worried sick." She glanced at the monitors, the tray, the paperwork on the counter. Her eyes flicked over everything, cataloging, assessing. She didn't ask how I felt. She asked how long I'd been there. Sloane crossed the room and reached for my hand. Her grip was light, careful. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't pull away. I didn't know how to explain the heaviness in my chest, the way the room felt smaller with them in it." Dr. Harris came back in a few minutes later, followed by a woman I hadn't seen before. She introduced herself as Detective Laura Perez with the Milwaukee Police Department. She was in her early 50s, hair pulled back neatly, her voice calm and even. She took in the room with one steady look. My mother's posture changed instantly. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said before anyone asked her a question. "My daughter gets migraines. She always has. She fell. It was a joke that went too far, that's all." Detective Perez nodded politely and asked if we could speak one at a time. She asked my mother to step outside for a moment. The request was gentle but firm. Sloane stayed. She sat close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one she'd worn to dinner the night before. She kept telling me I looked pale, that I scared everyone, that she'd never forgive herself if something was wrong. The detective asked me to describe what happened again. She asked who had been at the table. She asked who poured my drinks. She asked what I'd taken for the migraine and when. Her questions were precise, but her tone wasn't accusatory. That almost made it harder. I answered slowly, choosing my words. I said Sloane had been helping me. I said my family thought I was fine. I said I'd been told to rest. Sloane nodded along with every answer, her agreement immediate, reassuring. When my mother was brought back in, she was irritated. She said involving the police was unnecessary. She said this was a private family matter. She said I had a habit of escalating things and that it never ended well. I felt myself shrinking the way I always did, folding inward to keep the peace. The detective noticed. I could tell by the way her eyes moved between us, by the pause before her next question. She asked if anyone had discouraged me from seeing a doctor in the past. She asked if anyone helped manage my medications. She asked if there had been other falls or injuries. My mother answered before I could. She said I was clumsy. She said stress made me careless. She said Sloane had always looked out for me. Dr. Harris interrupted, gently reminding everyone that medical decisions were not a matter of opinion. He explained the findings again, the need for documentation, the reason a report had been filed. The word report landed hard in the room. Sloane's hand tightened around mine for just a second. My mother's jaw clenched. My stepfather said nothing at all. Detective Perez told us this didn't mean anyone was being accused. It meant questions had to be asked. It meant things needed to be written down. As they spoke, I realized something quietly, without drama. Whatever this had been before, joke, accident, misunderstanding, it wasn't staying that way. It had moved beyond what my family could smooth over with explanations and smiles. When they finally left the room, my mother turned to me and said low and sharp, "You don't know what you've started." I lay back against the pillow, the lights humming above me, my head pounding. For the first time, I wondered if that was exactly why they were afraid. Monday. March 11th arrived with a dull gray sky and a headache that hadn't fully let go. I was home from the hospital with instructions taped to my refrigerator: rest, limit screen time. No driving if dizzy. I followed them as best I could, sitting at my kitchen table with the blinds half closed, the quiet feeling unfamiliar after the noise of the day before. I told myself not to think about my family. Not yet. I needed something solid to hold on to, something that didn't shift, depending on who was in the room. That something turned out to be paperwork. Late that morning, my friend Jessa Nguyen stopped by. We'd worked together for years, long enough that she didn't ask questions right away. She set a bag of groceries on the counter, glanced at the bandage near my hairline, and said she'd make tea. That was how she always handled things: practical. First, emotions later. While the kettle heated, I pulled out a folder I hadn't opened in months. It was thick with documents I'd avoided because they reminded me of my grandfather and the estate mess that followed his death. At the time, I'd signed what I was told to sign and trusted my mother to manage the rest. I'd been tired then, grieving, willing to let someone else take over. Jessa sat across from me as I spread the papers out. She didn't touch anything, just watched. There it was, buried between routine notices and tax forms, a letter from a Madison-based estate attorney dated nearly a year ago. I'd skimmed it once and filed it away, assuming it was informational. Reading it now slowly, my stomach tightened. The letter referenced a family trust my grandfather had set up years before he died. It wasn't huge, but it was specific. Certain distributions were tied to age and independence language. About remaining one's own legal decision-maker. About no guardianship or conservatorship in place. There was also mention of a small commercial property held in trust. Income accumulating until a scheduled review. I felt heat creep up my neck. I flipped to the next page and saw notes in my mother's handwriting, reminders about meetings, deadlines, a comment in the margin. "We'll handle this when you're better." "When you're better," Jessa leaned in, reading over my shoulder. She didn't speak, but I could feel her attention sharpen. I thought about the timing of things I'd brushed off for years. The fall at the stairwell outside my old apartment, right before I was supposed to meet with a financial planner. The sudden migraine episode the week I mentioned wanting to look at the property records. The way Sloan always seemed to appear when I was overwhelmed, offering help, suggesting I take a break, telling me I didn't need to worry about grown-up decisions. A pattern began to form, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just steady and cold. I pushed the papers away and pressed my palms flat on the table. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. This wasn't about money in the way people like to frame things. It was about control, about whether I was seen as capable of owning my own life. Jessa finally spoke. "Have you ever had access to all of this on your own?" I shook my head. Saying it out loud made it sound worse than it felt. Worse than I'd let it feel. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The kettle clicked off behind us. The room smelled faintly of mint tea and paper. I realized then that whatever happened next couldn't be undone. I could put the folder back, tell myself I was reading too much into it, let my family step back into the role they'd always played. Or I could accept what the evidence was quietly suggesting and stop cooperating with my own disappearance. I picked the letter back up and slid it into a separate envelope. "I need to talk to someone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Jessa nodded once. "I'll help you find the right person." As she spoke, I understood that the silence I'd kept for so long had cost me more than headaches and hurt feelings. It had put real pieces of my life into other people's hands. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't give them back. Tuesday, March 12th was the first day I woke up without reaching for my phone to brace myself. The headache was still there, a dull echo instead of a roar, but something else had shifted. The quiet felt deliberate now, not imposed. I had made it that way. I started by changing the locks. It wasn't permanent, just a temporary rekey, something quick to buy myself time, until I understood what I was actually dealing with. The locksmith didn't ask why. He worked quickly, replacing cylinders, handing me a small envelope with new keys. When the door closed behind him, I stood in my entryway for a long moment, listening to the unfamiliar click as I tested the deadbolt. It didn't make me feel safe yet, but it sounded like the first boundary I'd ever put in place. By late morning, I was on the phone with Detective Laura Perez. She asked if I was somewhere private. I said yes. She asked if I was ready to answer questions more formally. I didn't hesitate. We spoke for nearly an hour. I gave dates, names, small details I'd always dismissed as unimportant. Who had my spare keys? Who refilled my prescriptions? who insisted on handling paperwork so I wouldn't stress. As I spoke, I heard how thin my old explanations sounded when laid out in order. Detective Perez didn't interrupt. When I finished, she asked if I would be willing to provide a written statement and authorize access to my medical and pharmacy records. She explained what that meant, what could happen next, and what it could cost me. I said yes anyway. That afternoon, I met with an attorney. Jessa had recommended a quiet woman named Marisol Vega, whose office overlooked the river. She listened as I described my family, my migraines, the trust documents. She didn't react with shock or sympathy. She reacted with focus. She explained my options plainly: how to protect my assets, how to limit contact, how to document interference. She told me that once certain steps were taken, there was no undoing them. Relationships would change, stories would harden. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand. The fallout started almost immediately. My mother left a voicemail accusing me of betrayal. She said I was letting strangers turn me against my own blood. Sloan sent a string of messages alternating between concern and irritation. She asked why I was being distant. She said the police had called her with questions and that it felt invasive. She reminded me how fragile my health was and suggested I let her handle things until I was back to myself. I didn't respond. Instead, I packed a small overnight bag and moved important documents to a friend's house for safekeeping. I forwarded my work email to a secure folder and notified HR that a family issue might escalate. Saying the words out loud made my stomach knot, but it also made the situation real in a way silence never had. That evening, Detective Perez called again. She told me they would be requesting warrants for digital records and security footage. She warned me that once that happened, my family would likely know this was serious. I looked around my apartment, the new locks, the cleared table, the folder of documents stacked neatly by the door. I thought about how many times I'd been told to wait to rest, to let someone else decide what was best for me. I understand, I said. When the call ended, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, breathing through the ache in my head. I felt fear sharp and undeniable. I also felt something steadier underneath it. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I wasn't chasing revenge in the way people like to imagine it. I was choosing to stop cooperating with the story that erased me. Whatever came next, anger, denial, retaliation. I knew I wouldn't be able to step back into the old role. The one where I apologized for being hurt. The one where I stayed quiet so others could stay comfortable. That door had closed, and this time I was the one who locked it. Thursday, March 14th was the day my sister stopped fighting me in private and started fighting me in public. Detective Perez asked me to come downtown that morning. She didn't promise anything dramatic. She just said they were ready to show me what they had, and that my reactions, what I recognized, what I could place in context, might matter later. I drove to the Milwaukee Police Department with my hands tight on the steering wheel, the kind of tightness that feels less like nerves and more like holding yourself together. In the small interview room, the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Detective Perez sat across from me with another investigator and a laptop. She didn't soften her words. She told me they had received the restaurant footage and had begun assembling a timeline. She told me they were also working through digital evidence obtained under warrant, and that I should be prepared to hear things I wouldn't want to hear. The video started at the bar. I watched Sloan from a security angle that took away everything charming about her. No flattering lighting, no friendly laughter around her. Just my sister scanning the room like she was checking for witnesses. Then her hand disappeared into her purse, came out with something small, and her body turned slightly, just enough to block the camera for half a second before she stirred my drink with a neat practiced motion. I felt my throat close. I'd spent years telling myself I was sensitive, that I overread things, that my migraines made me paranoid. But footage doesn't care about family narratives. It just shows what happened. They played the cake moment next, not the angle that would have looked like a prank. This camera caught her stance, how she planted her feet. It caught the force, the deliberate follow-through. It caught my head snapping back, and the brief, ugly stillness afterward. I didn't remember the seconds after I fell. Watching them made my stomach roll. Detective Perez paused the video before the next clip. She asked quietly, "Is that the table you hit?" I nodded. I could see the corner, the exact edge. I could see why the pain had changed overnight. I could also see something else, how quickly everyone moved into their roles. My mother leaning in, my stepfather hovering, people's hands half raised and then dropping like they were waiting to be told what to believe. Then the investigator shifted to the digital material. They didn't claim it was a confession. They didn't need to. They showed me screenshots and summary searches about conservatorships and guardianship, notes about episodes, a calendar entry marked only with my initials and dates that lined up too neatly with periods when I'd been injured or incapacitated. It was careful, cold, and organized like a project plan. Detective Perez slid a printed page toward me. A list of dates, short phrases, outcomes. My life reduced to bullet points. This establishes pattern, she said, and it helps explain motive. I didn't answer right away because there was a sound in my head that wasn't pain. It was the snap of a belief breaking. The belief that if I stayed calm enough, quiet enough, none of this was real. My phone buzzed while I was still staring at the paper. A voicemail from my mother. Her voice was tight and urgent, the way it gets when she's trying to regain control. She said officers had called the house. She said I was humiliating the family. She said Sloan was distraught, as if that was the only injury worth naming. Then came a text from Sloan herself. Not remorse, strategy. She wrote that I was spiraling, that my health was fragile, that I was letting outsiders poison my mind. She warned me that if I didn't stop, I'd regret what it did to my career. I showed Detective Perez the messages. She photographed them without reaction. I thought that would be the worst of it. It wasn't. By late afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. HR had received an email questioning my stability and judgment. It didn't name my sister, but it didn't have to. The language was familiar, medical insinuations concern, dressed up as professionalism. The implication that I was unreliable because I had migraines. The kind of doubt that spreads quietly and sticks. My supervisor's eyes stayed steady on mine. "I just want you to know," she said, "we're going to handle this by policy. If you have documentation, bring it to HR. Don't try to explain it in the hallway." I walked back to my desk, feeling like the floor had shifted. All my careful restraint, my decision not to argue with my family, not to send emotional texts, not to plead my side hadn't prevented the damage. It had simply delayed it until Sloan could aim it where it hurt most. That night, I met Marisol Vega again. I didn't dramatize anything. I laid the facts out, the footage, the digital notes, the HR email. Marisol listened, then spoke in the same calm voice she always used when something got serious. "This is a pressure test," she said. "They want you reactive. They want you to look unstable. You won't. We adjusted the plan. We documented the workplace interference. We prepared a clean factual statement for HR. No speeches, no family history, no emotion, just dates and evidence." Marisol told me to stop answering unknown numbers and to route everything through written channels whenever possible. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table with my folders and my phone face down. I didn't feel brave. I felt exposed. But underneath that, there was something new, the sense that I wasn't alone in this anymore. The truth had left the dining room and entered systems, medical, legal, professional, where charm and denial didn't automatically win. And I knew my sister wouldn't accept that quietly. Friday, March 15th didn't begin with confrontation. It began with paperwork. I met Marisol Vega mid-morning in her office. the kind of place designed to look neutral and calming, but rarely used for calm conversations. She had already reviewed the materials from the day before the footage, the digital notes, the documented interference at my workplace. She didn't rehash the details. She focused on sequence. This is the point, she said, tapping the file once, where the system stops observing and starts containing. She explained what that meant in practical terms. A temporary protective order, clearly defined boundaries, no accusations argued in living rooms, no emotional standoffs. The purpose wasn't punishment. It was prevention of contact, of pressure, of escalation. It would be served formally, calmly, with witnesses. And once served, it would no longer be optional. I listened, nodding, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, more like structure. The order was approved that afternoon. Marisol didn't let me leave with assumptions. She went line by line explaining what the order did and didn't do. It didn't mean an arrest. It didn't mean guilt had been decided. It meant distance. It meant silence enforced by rules instead of endurance. By early evening, I drove to my mother's house because that was where my sister already was. Not because anyone planned a confrontation, but because life doesn't pause while legal processes move forward. The house looked the same as it always had, lights on, familiar cars in the driveway, a sense of normalcy that felt increasingly artificial. The officer arrived shortly after I did. There was no raised voice, no urgency, just a knock, an introduction, and an envelope. The officer addressed my sister by name, confirmed her identity, and explained why he was there. He spoke carefully, the way people do when every word matters. I stayed seated. My sister read the order once without expression, then again, more slowly. Her face didn't collapse into tears or anger. It tightened. She asked procedural questions: how long it lasted, what counted as contact, what happened if someone else reached out on her behalf. The officer answered each one the same way, factually, without debate. My mother tried to intervene. She asked if this was really necessary, if families couldn't work things out privately. The officer repeated that the order wasn't a negotiation and wasn't open for discussion. It existed because a judge had signed it. The room went quiet in a way that felt permanent. When the officer left, my sister turned toward me. There was no apology, no explosion, just a flat statement that this wasn't over, that I was making a mistake, that I didn't understand the consequences. Her voice carried the same certainty it always had, as if conviction alone could still bend reality. I didn't respond. That was new. I left shortly after, not because I was afraid of staying, but because there was nothing left to say. On the drive home, Detective Perez called to confirm service and to reiterate the boundaries. She reminded me to document any attempted contact, no matter how indirect. She reminded me that enforcement only came into play if lines were crossed. This part feels anticlimactic to a lot of people, she said. But it's where things actually change. When I got home, I placed my copy of the protective order on the kitchen table. I didn't read it again. I already knew what mattered for the first time. Distance between my sister and me wasn't something I had to negotiate or defend. It was written, enforced, external. I changed the locks that night, not out of panic, but consistency. This time, it was final, new hardware, new codes, nothing provisional left in place. I forwarded unanswered messages to my attorney instead of replying. I turned my phone off before bed and slept without bracing for interruption. The system hadn't resolved anything yet, but it had drawn a line that didn't depend on anyone believing my version of events, and that line held. The first court date was Tuesday, March 19th, and I barely slept the night before. Not because I doubted what had happened, but because I finally understood the cost of saying it out loud. Once a family secret becomes a case number, it stops being something you can work out privately. It becomes a record, a timeline. a set of facts that don't care who feels offended. The courthouse in Milwaukee smelled like old stone and floor wax. I sat on a bench outside the courtroom with Marisol Vega beside me, my folder of documents on my lap like a shield. Across the hall, Sloane stood with her public defender hair, smoothed posture straight, as if this were an inconvenience she could outlast. My mother wasn't there. My stepfather wasn't there either. They'd made their choice by absence. Detective Perez nodded at me once when she arrived, a small acknowledgement that made my throat tighten. Then the doors opened and we filed in. The hearing moved quickly. The prosecutor summarized the charges and the basis for them. Dr. Harris's medical findings, the restaurant footage, the digital data recovered under warrant, the documented pattern of interference, and the references to guardianship and control. They didn't need my pain to be persuasive. They had exhibits. When it was Sloane's turn, her attorney tried to frame it as misunderstanding and overreach. He used words like family conflict, stress, medical sensitivity. He hinted that my migraines made me unreliable. The judge didn't react. She listened, then asked direct questions that had nothing to do with personalities and everything to do with risk. Was there evidence of tampering? Was there evidence of prior injury? Was there evidence of ongoing contact and pressure? Was there a reason to protect the alleged victim while the case proceeded? Marisol squeezed my hand once under the bench. Not comfort, reminder, stay still. The judge issued an order of protection. No contact. No indirect contact. No third parties. A specified distance from my home and workplace. She set the next dates and warned that violations would carry consequences. Before we left the courtroom, the judge added one more clarification. Given the overlapping financial interests and the ongoing investigation, she ordered a temporary review of any assets tied to my name. Until that review is complete, she said informal family management was no longer appropriate. Any decisions or access would be routed through neutral oversight. I didn't exhale until the gavel came down. Outside the courtroom, my phone lit up with messages I didn't open. News travels fast in families like mine. Someone had already decided I was to blame for the embarrassment. Someone had already started rewriting the story. But the system didn't care about the rewrite. That afternoon, I got a call from the trust administrator's office, an independent fiduciary, appointed temporarily while questions were resolved. My mother's informal control over the trust paperwork was suspended. Everything would go through neutral channels now. No more will handle it. No more missing letters. It was the first time in my adult life that something financial connected to my name wasn't filtered through my mother. Then the professional consequences began. Sloane's business partners requested distance. A contract was paused pending review. A client backed out. Her carefully built image, competent, charming, harmless, was suddenly paired with words like warrant and protective order. Not gossip, public record. None of it felt like victory. It felt like gravity. I drove home and sat in my apartment with the blinds open, letting the late winter light sit on my skin. My head still ached. My stomach still tightened every time my phone buzzed. Justice wasn't a clean moment. It wasn't the end of fear. It was a series of doors closing one by one on the ways my sister had reached into my life. That day, the law didn't heal me, but it did something I'd never had before. It believed me in writing. By late April, the quiet had a different weight to it. Not the tense quiet of waiting for the next phone call or court notice, but the steady kind that settles in when a door has finally closed the way it was meant to. The case moved forward without spectacle. Sloane accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial. The charges remained on the record, and the protective order was made long-term. No contact. No indirect messages. No exceptions for family. The judge was clear that violations would mean immediate consequences, not warnings. I wasn't in the courtroom when it was finalized. I didn't need to be. My presence wasn't required for the system to finish what it had started. The trust administrator confirmed in writing that control of my grandfather's assets was formally separated from my mother. Everything was routed through neutral oversight now. No favors, no pressure, no rewriting history in the margins of paperwork. It wasn't a windfall. It was something better than that. It was mine. Work stabilized once HR had documentation. The questions stopped. The unspoken doubts lost their footing when facts replaced whispers. I went back to my routine slowly with accommodations I asked for instead of apologizing for. Migraine care became proactive, not reactive. A neurologist who listened. A plan that didn't involve pushing through pain to make others comfortable. My mother reached out once through an email carefully worded and clearly edited. She said she didn't recognize the family anymore. She said she was grieving what she thought we were. She asked if there was any way back. I didn't reply right away. When I did, it was brief. I told her I wasn't discussing reconciliation. I told her I was focusing on staying well. I wished her stability, nothing more. That boundary held. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in ordinary moments. Mornings without bracing myself. Evenings where my phone stayed silent. The relief of knowing no one was monitoring my weakness for leverage. I rearranged my apartment, let more light in, gave away things I'd kept out of guilt instead of attachment. I stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't earned explanations. The memory of the cake never fully disappeared. Neither did the sound of laughter right before I fell. But those memories stopped defining the edges of my life. They became reference points, not anchors. For years, I'd been told endurance was my best quality, that keeping the peace made me strong. I know better now. Strength was choosing truth when silence felt safer. Strength was letting the system do its job instead of protecting people who harmed me. Strength was walking away without needing the last word. I didn't win by watching my sister fall. I won by standing up and staying there. What I built after wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was stable. It was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. If you've stayed with this story, thank you. If you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own safety, your experience matters. Feel free to share your thoughts or your story below. And if this resonated with you, you're welcome to follow along for more stories like this.